Welcome back to the Buffalo Reformed Podcast. In this episode, I would like to discuss a somewhat controversial topic. The reason it's controversial is because most Christian denominations have their own definitions for these things, but I'm not going to be going through what everybody believes about this. The purpose of this talk is simply to bring up the problem of institutional drift, institutional corruption, and the way that I think it can be addressed, and the way that I think the denomination that I am in, the CREC, is seeking to address it. So I'm using this talk today as a means of bringing up this problem that I think is a real issue for Christianity, and that if we can address it, who knows what the Lord will do with our witness in the future, for future generations. And so I have it titled simply Ordination, and we're going to look through the Presbyterian view of ordination. We're going to then discuss institutional purity and the problem of credentialism. And you can see here, by way of outline, we're going to go through the typical progression of a Presbyterian ordination and how they view it, based on, and we're going to use the OPC as an example. And then the problem of credentialism, which is going to be defined, and we'll look at what that is and how I think it's leading to institutional corruption. And then the CREC's solution, the Communion of Reformed Evangelicals Churches, their solution to this problem. So first, let's look at the Orthodox Presbyterian Church as basically a sample of the typical Presbyterian view of ordination, and this will get the discussion started. So this comes directly from the Book of Church Order, which was done in 2020, and I like to point out this is a very true statement that they have in the preface. As Presbyterians have put this in the past, a book that rightly orders the church is not necessary for the being of the church, since there are true churches that do not follow these rules and procedures, but is necessary for the well-being of the church. End quote. And I've heard other people say that the government of the church is not what makes the church, but it is for the good of the church. So the government of the church is not the essence of the church, but it exists for the good of the church, for the well-being of the church. And what that means is that there are multiple ways that this could be done and still be pleasing to the Lord. It's just a matter of trying to maintain good order in the Church of God. But I think that the way that it has come to be in modern Presbyterianism is lending itself towards institutional drift. And because of that, I think that we're losing our credible witness in the public square. But this is how it's supposed to happen in the Presbyterian Church. And we're using, again, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church as our case study. So from their form of government, chapter 20, it defines ordination as the act by which men are set apart to the offices of deacon, ruling elder, and minister. It is the church's solemn approval of and public attestation to a man's inward call, his gifts, and his calling by the church. And then it says that the church shall invest him with the office only when satisfied as to his gifts, and only in response to a call to do work appropriate to that office. The ordaining body, before investing a man with office, shall provide or assure itself he has received such training and testing of gifts as may be necessary for the proper performance of the duties required by the office. Okay, that's a lot of verbiage, but we'll just break it down. Ordination is the setting apart of a man for the offices of deacon, ruling elder, and minister. So they're saying that these are the offices of the church. And ordination is the process by which we have selected men and put them into those offices. And it's a public thing. It's the church's public approval of this person, and they're attesting that this person has not only the inward call to ministry, but he has the gifts that are necessary for it, and the church is actually calling him into this office. So all those things are present. And what the next statement is saying is that they should only be doing this process with men that they have assured themselves have actually satisfied those things. They must have the gifts, and they must have a legitimate call from a body before the church is actually putting someone into that office. And then the other thing I want to point out, because this is, I think, one of the points of contention that I'll be bringing up later, notice in the last statement there that it says that the ordaining body, whether that be the presbytery or the local church session of elders, before they invest this man with office, shall provide such training and testing of gifts as may be necessary for the proper performance of the duties required by the office. This isn't so much the norm these days. It's more so the or assure itself that he has received. That is the typical procedure. Rather than the presbytery providing the services necessary to train someone or to give him the tools he will need to adequately operate as a minister, generally speaking, that is outsourced to a seminary. That's not going to be done by the presbytery. So ordinarily, seminary is going to be doing that, and then the presbytery is going to be assuring itself that he has received adequate instruction, and they'll do that by means of testing. So to summarize all of this, there is an observation of the required gifts. Now, the OPC calls this the inward call. But I write it this way to highlight that the inward call is made manifest by the outward. So some will describe this inward call as a feeling. I felt led to pursue ordination. Say it something like that. But I'm going to make the argument that the inward call is really manifest in how this person is operating in the body. He is caring for the flock. He sees a need and he seeks to address that need, even though by all human accounts, by external accounts, it's not his responsibility to do it. But for some reason, he has this internal call that this need that he sees, he needs to be addressing it. It's how he's operating in and among the body. I call that observation of the required gifts. That's the inward call. If a man has observable giftings that he's operating within the body, and he's doing that not out of compulsion by an external body, but because he is seeing a need and meeting that need, then this is what I think constitutes the inward call. And if we're talking about how you determine if a person has an inward call, then I think that this is best put as an observer looking at somebody who's claiming they have an inward call, rather than the person just saying, yes, I feel called to the ministry. What I'm saying is there should be some tangible evidence that this person has been called to the ministry, and that tangible evidence is typically how are they operating within a body already. But that is an important point. We'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. But so we'll just say that this person has been exercising their gifts in and among the body. And so then that ordinarily leads to a congregation calling this person to formally exercise their giftings among the body. So they're observing that this person has these gifts, and they're exercising those gifts in and among the body. And then this results in a call to formally exercise those gifts in and among the body. This call must be approved by a presbytery, so then at that point the man would then go before the presbytery, and if he has had no training at this point, then the presbytery, it says according to the OPC Book of Church Order, must provide that training. But if he already has seminary training, if he already has the requisite knowledge, then the presbytery must test that knowledge. And then only after that process has been gone through is when there's a formal recognition that this man has been, that he can be ordained and installed into that local congregation for service. It goes on to say in the Book of Church Order, ordination shall be performed by the body which examines the candidate. In the case of deacons and ruling elders, it shall be by the session. In the case of ministers, ordination shall be by the presbytery. So I just want to take note of this. The local session ordains the local offices, and from the OPC perspective, that would be a ruling elder and deacon. Those are local offices. So the presbytery doesn't really have any involvement in that ordinarily. But the presbytery is the ordaining body of the ministers. So the collection of elders, ministers and ruling elders, in a region in the OPC polity, and this is, again, a case example for how Presbyterians typically do this. The collection of elders in a particular region, so there's the Presbytery of New York and New England in the OPC, that the collection of ministers is called a presbytery. So the ministers and the elders in that region are the presbytery. And in Presbyterian polity, that presbytery is considered a regional church. It's considered a regional church. And it is that church that has been given the sacraments from Presbyterian polity, in Presbyterian polity, from that perspective. So think about that for a minute. If a church does not have a minister, so somebody who is a member of that regional body, then they cannot, from the OPC perspective, celebrate the sacraments. Okay? So there must be someone from the regional church who comes and administers those sacraments to the congregation. Okay? So what that means practically is that the sacraments from the Presbyterian view, they are held by the regional church, the presbytery. The presbytery is the one who has the sacraments, and then they are dispensing them to the congregations that they have been entrusted with. This is how they're thinking about it. Local church cannot celebrate the sacraments without a representative from the regional church who is administering them. And I'm highlighting this for a reason. The minister's membership is not held in the local body. The minister's membership is held in the regional body, in the presbytery. And that regional body is the one that holds the sacraments. And that regional body, that regional church, is the body that ordains the minister from the typical Presbyterian perspective. Okay, so for ruling elders, for deacons, the local congregation ordains them. But ruling elders from this perspective do not administer the sacraments, and they don't preach. Only the ministers do that. And the ministers are members of the regional church, the presbytery, and so it's only the regional church who holds the sacraments and then dispenses them to the local congregation. This is high Presbyterianism. That's how it functions. So now that's how it would typically happen that's how it's on paper written for the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. You have somebody who has these giftings. If we just go back a slide, they have these giftings. The church calls this person who has been demonstrating their giftings, and then that person then goes before the presbytery, and then at that point it depends on if they have the training or not. If they don't, the training should be provided. If they do, then they would be tested, and then if they pass the testing, then they would be ordained and installed. Okay, so we saw how this happens on paper in the OPC, how it's laid out in the Book of Church Order. But this is now the modern pathway to ordination. This is how it happens a lot of times. Not always, okay? There is, I'm not going to deny that these Presbyterian denominations, they still do have a means by which somebody desiring ordination in their denomination is going to be serving a local congregation before they are officially installed as a minister within that congregation. There is a pathway for that, and many men do follow that. But I'm arguing against this particular pathway, which happens quite a bit, and I think is leading towards institutional drift. So this is how it could happen potentially in modern Presbyterianism. So rather than there being a compulsion to care for the flock, so rather than this person seeing needs and then meeting those needs, there's rather a desire to pursue a particular identity and career. So this person's then saying, I want to be a pastor. I want to have that credential. I want to have that title. I want to have that authority, whatever it is. In the same way that somebody would say, I want to be a medical doctor. I want to study medicine. I want to diagnose patients. I want to be able to make care decisions for people. In the same manner that somebody would desire that, this person is desiring this particular career. So what is often the thought process is, in order to do that, in order to become a pastor, to obtain this career field, I have to pursue a particular credential. So I have to go to seminary. So that's what happens. They then leave their local congregation and go to a seminary. And I'm not arguing against the use of seminaries. I think they are good and necessary. We need them in order to establish theological depth and preparedness for the ministry. I'm not against seminaries at all. I'm just going through how this happens a lot of times. So he goes to seminary. He obtains the testing of his knowledge and his gifts. Okay, but the gifts that are being tested there are not the same gifts of service that we were describing earlier, that are observed within a congregation. They are gifts of preaching and teaching ordinarily, their understanding of systematic theology, biblical languages, polity, church government, things like that, church history. Those are the things that are being tested in the seminary. And so whenever we think of going to seminary and he's obtaining testing of his knowledge and gifts, what's primarily being tested there is his ability to interpret the scriptures, preach the word, understand church history, have that deep theological understanding. Those are the things that are being tested primarily in that setting. So then after he obtains his credential, his Master of Divinity, now he needs to go and pursue licensure or ordination. It's similar in medicine. Once you go to med school, then you need to go sit before the boards, you need to go through residency, all of those things, right? And this is how we are treating the pastorate in this way, frame of thinking. So this person, in pursuing this career path now, he goes to the presbytery, he becomes an intern maybe in a local congregation, but he gets approved by the presbytery to preach and teach and to function as a minister. And over the course of time, however long it takes, depends on the person and the situation, this man receives a call from a congregation. And it could be the congregation he is interning in, or it could be a different congregation that has a need of a minister. He then goes and preaches at that church and fills out their application, gives an account of himself to the church, basically preaches a couple of times, and then they call him in to meet with the session and the congregation. And then if they say, yes, we want to see this guy as our minister, then they will extend a call to him. And they'll say, we want you to come and be our pastor. At that point, he then goes before the presbytery in which that church resides. Okay, so if it was like in New York, it would be in the Presbytery of New York and New England in the OPC. Then that presbytery would look over the call, which is like, this is how much we're going to pay him, this is how we're going to take care of the minister. And then they would examine the man and make sure that he has the requisite giftings. And again, in this context, we're not necessarily talking about temperament and character. We're talking primarily about theological understanding, confessional adherence, and ability to interpret the scriptures and proclaim the word of God. Those are the things that are being valued. Are those bad things? Not at all. They're all very good things. But I'm just trying to point out here the conspicuous absence of having the character and the temperament and the service of this person as the bedrock of why we're taking them through this process, as opposed to it being they have this seminary degree, they have come before the presbytery's approved them, this church has heard them for a couple of weeks preach and teach, and they think that they're good, and then the presbytery approves it, and then they put them into that office in the church. And that's what would happen. The presbytery would ordain him, and then he'd be installed by that presbytery into that church to be the minister. So the fear I have is that when the OPC Book of Church Order says that they're satisfied as to his gifts, I fear that what is actually being said there is that they are satisfied as to his ability to preach and teach. And when his preaching and teaching ability are viewed as desirous by a church, and particularly a church that the man has no meaningful pastoral relationship with, that's when he's formally ordained and installed in that body by the presbytery. It's not because he has a record of service, self-sacrificial service to this body. It's because his preaching and teaching are deemed agreeable to that body. And then the church is trusting the fact that that presbytery has really thoroughly vetted this person in terms of his character and temperament. And the presbytery, in turn, is relying upon the seminary, that the seminary has really vetted this person in terms of their temperament and character and knowledge. And the seminary is entrusting that on the original local congregation in which that person originally started. So that is a whole chain of events that ultimately leads to this man being installed in a local congregation. So this is where I'm going to bring up credentialism. Merriam-Webster definition is an undue emphasis on credentials, such as college degrees, as prerequisites to employment. So rather than emphasizing service to the body as the foundation on which the training rests, we have essentially flipped the emphasis. We now emphasize knowledge and rhetorical skill as the foundation on which the pastoral ministry rests. And we base their overall fitness as a minister on their credentials from seminary and presbytery. The church allows a man to minister to them, meaning leading services, that's really what we mean, only if he has the needed credentials, ordinarily an MDiv and then approval of the presbytery. Rather than basing the man's ministry on his proven care for the flock, we've essentially outsourced that responsibility to the centralized powers, the seminary and the presbytery. These bodies are, I'm arguing, not equipped to adequately judge a man's character. It is the daily grinding service to the body that tests a man's character. It's not his ability to write papers, preach sermons, and follow a liturgy. That's not what makes a man a pastor. By way of example here, before we start talking positively, I'm going to talk about what I'm calling the Frank Initiative. In the Chronicles of Narnia, the first book chronologically, The Magician's Nephew, there's in the story, the witch, Diggory and Polly accidentally bring the witch into our world. And in their process of trying to bring the witch back out of our world, they accidentally bring a cabbie, somebody who operates a cab with a horse and a carriage in that time, with them into Narnia as it's being newly created. And Aslan wants to make this cabbie the king of Narnia. And when the cabbie hears this, he says this quote, "I never had much education, you see," and Lewis is telling us something about this. That's the credentials that we typically would want to see. We'd want to see in a king somebody who can actually pronounce the word education, and doesn't contract their words in a manner that is considered colloquial and backwoodsy, redneck. And so what is Aslan's response to that? He says, well, and I'm going to quote these, "Can you use a spade and a plow and raise food out of the earth? Can you rule these creatures kindly and fairly, remembering that they are not slaves, like the dumb beasts of the world you were born in, but talking beasts and free subjects? And would you bring up your children and grandchildren to do the same? And if enemies came against the land, for enemies will arise, and there was war, would you be the first in the charge and the last in the retreat? Then," said Aslan, "you will have done all that a king should do." And I highlight this story to point out that maybe we are, in modern-day Presbyterianism, emphasizing the wrong syllable in the word, the wrong syllable. Are we equating rhetorical skill, theological depth and knowledge, are we equating those things with the required gifts for ministry? And the question there, we say that there is a dearth of pastors, and are we saying that there's a dearth of people who have the requisite theological depth and nuance and ability with the original languages and their understanding of church history? Or are we saying there is a dearth of Franks, people who have this ordinary Christian piety? They know how to work. They know how to be fair and just. They know how to raise their household, have their household in order. They care for the flock when it is oppressed by enemies, from within or even from without. And they will fight them courageously, saying what needs to be said. If somebody's operating like this, then they are operating like a king. It doesn't matter what kind of credentials they have, they are acting kingly. So, is there actually a dearth of Franks in our local churches? I'm going to argue no. I think we have Franks in our local churches. We just don't have our conception of what a minister is supposed to be. So we have a dearth of our conception of ministers. We don't have a dearth of Franks. And so to highlight this in a positive way, I'm going to point out what the CREC does in terms of ordination. Because I think that they are addressing this very problem in how they do ordination. But I want you to take note of a couple of things. So first, let's go through what their process of ordination is very briefly. This comes from the governing documents of the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, their Book of Procedures. It's Article 11. It says the first stage requires the local church to evaluate the man's character, family life, and gifts, making use of a variety of means, including adequate outside input from those who have known him and his family, as well as direct observation of his pastoral gifts and temperament. So right out of the gate, they're saying that the local church has the responsibility of ensuring that this person has the requisite giftings. That it would be really hard to do if you're basing it off of 2 weeks of a minister coming in to preach and teach and just meet everybody. It's very difficult to do. What this implies is that this person has been in that body for quite some time, serving, before the church is willing to say, yes, they have those gifts. Then it says, once that threshold has been cleared, the local church can move forward with asking the presbytery to examine the man regarding his biblical knowledge and doctrinal orthodoxy, which is their primary domain. So they're saying that the questions of whether this person has the temperament and character, those have to be answered at the local church level. The questions of his biblical knowledge and doctrinal orthodoxy, the presbytery exists to help with those things. A lot of local churches don't have the resources required to really adequately train a minister. And so the presbytery exists to help support the local church in their training of the minister. That's how the CREC has chosen to use the presbytery. The presbytery is not the one that is vetting their character or their temperament, although they do that. That's not the primary responsibility for that rests with the local congregation. And then the responsibility of the presbytery is to ensure this person is orthodox and that they have the required biblical knowledge. Okay, so when both the local church's positive evaluation of the man's character, family life, gifts, and temperament combined with the presbytery's positive evaluation of the man's knowledge and doctrinal soundness come together, only then should the man be ordained to the gospel ministry. And then they talk about what ordination is. The ordination of a pastor or minister is the act of conferring and confirming ministerial gifts. The laying on of hands imparts a spiritual gift for ministerial service. A minister ordained to serve God's flock must possess the necessary character and skills along with knowledge, understanding, and wisdom in the Scripture in order to adequately fulfill his calling. I just want to point out, too, the conferring of gifts is not in some mystical sense. They're not like granting him special powers. The way I think about this is it's the idea that the institutional weight can be added to the already established authority this man possesses as a gift from the Holy Spirit. So, in other words, the man's life of piety and his knowledge he has already give him authority in a sense. But when the institution confirms this and then declares it publicly, that should be a conferring of ministerial authority as backed by that institution. So it is a powerful combination of those things. This person has the giftings, they have true piety, and then they also have the requisite knowledge. They have real knowledge and wisdom. And then the instituted church is saying, yes, they have the required wisdom and knowledge. So, in summary, notice, it's an observation of the required gifts, followed by a call from the local congregation, and then either the testing or the training, depending on where the person falls, by the presbytery. And so if the congregation is calling somebody who has no training, but they're saying that the way that they are operating within the body is very conducive to the health of the body, demonstrates an inward call, and they think he has the required character and skill to be a minister, So then they say, we want to call him to be our pastor. He comes before the presbytery, and the presbytery says he's not quite ready as far as his knowledge in our estimation. Here's what we recommend as far as his education. And then that would proceed until he's ready to be tested. And then once he's ready to be tested, after he is tested and approved, then he would be ordained. But that is exactly the same pattern that we outlined when we were looking at how the OPC has it written in their Book of Church Order. This is how it ought to go. But now compare this to how it is practically done, or the modern way that it is done. And this happens in both denominations, but I think it's much more common in the OPC than it would be in the CREC. This is, again, the modern pathway laid out this way. It's instead of the recognition of gifts, it's the pursuit of a credential. And then rather than this being refined, these giftings being refined by a seminary or by a presbytery, instead, there's what follows is an internship or preaching circuit, which is then allowing this person to hone the gifts of preaching and teaching, more so than of pastoral ministry, of real service to the body. Then comes the call, then the testing, then the ordination. So instead of long, observable service to the body being the foundation of pastoral ministry, with tested temperament and character, the decisive foundation has quietly become a credential from a seminary and or a presbytery. The man then exercises those gifts, mainly preaching and teaching, for a short season among a congregation, and if his sermons are agreeable, they call him. And only after the call does the presbytery formally examine and ordain him, at which point everyone begins to find out whether he actually has the character Scripture requires. So I'll say it succinctly this way. Rather than observing a man's service and character in the local body, then calling, training, and installing him, we now train and install men first, and only afterward discover whether they possess the character and proven service that should have been the starting point. And what does this result in? Potentially, it could result in men with knowledge, but no true piety. They don't actually have the character that's required. They don't have regard for Christ's bride. They don't have service to the body as being the foundation for their pastoral ministry. This can lead to political actors rather than ministers. Men who are interested in authority, in clout, in reputation, more than they're interested in service to Christ's body. It can lead to paid professionals who are just doing this because they're paid to do it, rather than pastors who are caring for the flock. This is, I'm arguing, the modern result. Rather than having Franks who are then refined because they already have proven their service to the body, we now have men who are pursuing a status rather than and that status that they then achieve is based upon their abilities of rhetoric and of knowledge rather than on proven service to the body. So the foundation is on the credential, it's not upon service to the body. And this can result in political actors and paid professionals rather than ministers and pastors. By way of example, I want us to consider Boniface, calling this the Boniface effect. This is what is necessary. I'm in the process of reading this book, Charlemagne, by Derek Wilson. And in the book, he in the beginning of it, he describes the influences on Charlemagne that led to his great influence on Western civilization. And one of those influences was the monks that were present in modern-day United Kingdom. What had happened is there was an ineffective witness of the institutional church to the pagans in that area, in the United Kingdom. All these monasteries had been planted, but there was an ineffective witness because there was institutional corruption. There were monks that were sleeping with nuns. There were nuns committing abortions. Essentially, the inside of the monasteries was no different than the pagan villages that they were seeking to redeem. They were seeking to bring salvation to these people, bring the gospel to these people. And those people are looking at these institutions and saying, that's no different than what we already do. It's just more powerful. So why would we bow down to that God? Enter Boniface. Boniface went into these institutions and greatly purified them. He kicked out people who were not repenting and were engaging in sinful practices. He purified those institutions, and that activity led to great cultural influence, but particularly the zeal that they had for institutional purity, for true piety and true education, true knowledge, had a great effect on Charlemagne. Ineffective witness, if I'm going to say this succinctly, ineffective witness due to institutional corruption required institutional purification before there was anything like real cultural influence. Okay? So here's some quotes just to set the stage here. Institutionalism reigned. Top ecclesiastical jobs went to members of the Francia's elite families, so this is nepotism. Monasteries and bishoprics grew rich and indolent on the offerings of the nobility. We don't care about your spiritual health, we just care about how much you're giving to the church. The Frankish church lost its cutting edge as an agent for evangelism, education, and moral reform. Enter the Celtic missionaries. Okay. These puritanical and purifying missionaries exercised a profound influence on Charlemagne. He was stirred by their zeal and impressed by their scholarship, and it was a shared passion for the gospel that provided the inspiration for his own mission. Even when orthodoxy was impeccable, morality often was not. In a turbulent age, the authority of the clergy depended almost entirely on their education and the purity of their lives. All too often they forfeited any influence they might have enjoyed by ignorant and unbridled behavior. The peripatetic, which means he was traveling, he was going around to all of the monasteries, the peripatetic Boniface expended more effort in disciplining adulterous monks and clerical rapists than in bringing heathens to the baptismal font. The focus of his ministry was on purifying the institution. It actually wasn't on bringing heathens into the church. And this is interesting because we really think of Boniface as being the guy who cut down the tree. He was uncompromising towards pagan false religion, towards spiritualism and idolatry. When really whenever we think of Boniface, we should be thinking of him as somebody who greatly purified the institutional church so that it could have a more effective witness in the public square. And so, in summary, the OPC and the CREC have the same on-paper values in terms of ordination. Real gifts that somebody has and is exercising in the body then result in a call from a congregation that the instituted church officially and publicly ordain this person to ministry so that those gifts can have more weight and authority. And then only then is that person trained and refined, already having the necessary character. He then is getting the competency he needs to operate well in that area, in that office, and then he is ordained and installed into that office. So on paper, the OPC and the CREC have the same on-paper values. There is a real difference between the two. The OPC has the regional church as being the one that ordains the minister, and therefore the regional church is the one that's primarily entrusted with vetting the minister before they ordain them. That's not going to be primarily given to the local church in order to do that. And what that has led to, I'm arguing, is this credentialistic approach to the ministry, where these men are just they're obtaining the credentials that are necessary to be approved by the governing body, the presbytery, so that then they can go into a congregation and minister. And that has led to a crop of ministers in our modern context who care more about their career than they care about feeding the flock. They care more about political prestige in a presbytery, in the ecclesiastical structures, than they care about the bride of Christ and the purity of the bride of Christ. So I am arguing for the Frank Initiative, where we prioritize true basic piety over credentialed knowledge. I'm not against institutions. I'm not against training and knowledge, particularly in the original languages and in church history. I am all for those things. I think they are necessary and good. But they cannot be the foundation upon which pastoral ministry rests. It must be basic, common Christian piety, like King Frank had. If somebody has this, they will be operating as a king, as an elder, as a ruler in Christ's church, as somebody who will protect his bride, as somebody who has been entrusted with free citizens in Christ's church. Not so he doesn't rule them by compulsion, but by example and by great care and patience. The purity of our institutions is at stake, and potentially the shape of future civilizations, as evidenced by the anecdote with Boniface. Boniface spent a lot of time, more time, purifying the institution than he spent fighting the pagans. And I'm making the argument here that if we can purify our institutions, and we actually have some regard for the purity of the institutions, then this is what will lead to our ability to bring in the heathen, to bring the heathen into our house. We have to clean our house before we can expect the heathen to want to come into it. But if the house is operating in a manner that's no different than how the heathen operate, that's no better, then what in the world is going to drive a heathen into the arms of Christ? How are we representing Christ and his name in the public square in our institutions?